Threads of History, a podcast that aims to go back in time to connect an event or instance to its origin through several threads of continuity across time, space, culture, and historic moments. Welcome to the podcast. I am Mike Shellhammer. Today's episode is on the Great Flood of 1889 in Johnstown, Pennsylvania. Its origin through the catastrophic failure of a neglected dam and the massive reservoir behind it, which was created for a short-lived canal, and the greed which ultimately led to the destruction of Johnstown. The first canals were created in prehistory. They were irrigation canals built to contribute to the agricultural revolution and the creation of the first permanent settlements and proto-governments in history. The oldest canals in the world yet found by archaeologists were built in Mesopotamia circa 4000 BC. In present-day Iraq, the Indus Valley Civilization in present-day India and Pakistan had sophisticated irrigation and storage systems developed by 3000 BC, including the reservoirs built at Gurnar to provide the area with fresh water for agriculture. In Egypt, canals date back at least to the time of the Old Kingdom and a 6th dynasty pharaoh, Pepi I, who reigned from 2332 BC to 2283 BC, who ordered a canal built to bypass a cataract on the Nile River near Aswan. In ancient China, large canals for river transport were established as far back as the Spring and Autumn period, which is the 5th to 8th centuries BC, the longest one of that period being the Hongguo, the Canal of the Wild Geese, which according to the ancient historian Sima Qian, connected the old states of Song, Jiang, Shen, Kai, Cao, and Wei. The modern canal system was mainly a product of the 18th and early 19th centuries. It came into being because the Industrial Revolution, which began in Britain during the mid-18th century, demanded an economical and reliable way to transport goods and commodities in large quantities. This was best done through water transportation. In the early years of the United States, transportation of goods between the coastal ports and the interior was slow and difficult. Close to the seacoast, rivers provided easy inland transportation up to the fall line, since floating vessels encountered much less friction than land vehicles. However, the Appalachian Mountains were a great obstacle to further transportation or settlement, stretching 1,500 miles from Maine to Mississippi, with just 5 places where mule trains or wagon roads could be routed. Passengers and freight bound for the western parts of the country had to travel overland, a journey made more difficult by the rough condition of the roads. In 1800, it typically took 2.5 weeks to travel overland from New York City to Cleveland, Ohio, and 4 weeks to Detroit, Michigan. The principal exportable product of the Ohio Valley was grain, which was a high-volume, low-priced commodity, bolstered by supplies from the coast. Frequently, it was not worth the cost of transporting it to faraway population centers. This was a factor leading to farmers in the West turning their grains into whiskey for easier transport and higher sales, and of course later the Whiskey Rebellion. In the 18th and early 19th centuries, it became clear to coastal residents that the city or state that succeeded in developing a cheap, reliable route to the West would enjoy economic success, and the port at the seaward end of such a route would see business increase greatly. In time, projects were devised in Virginia, Maryland, Pennsylvania, and relatively deep into the coastal states. The idea of a canal to tie the East Coast to the western settlements was discussed as early as 1724. Governor Morris and Elkanah Watson were early proponents of a canal along the Mohawk River. Their efforts led to the creation of the Western and Northern Inland Lock Navigation Companies in 1792, which took the first steps to improve navigation on the Mohawk and construct a canal between the Mohawk and Lake Ontario, but it was soon discovered that private financing was insufficient. Christopher Colles, who was familiar with the Bridgewater Canal, surveyed the Mohawk Valley and made a presentation to the New York State Legislature in 1784, proposing a shorter canal from Lake Ontario. The proposal drew attention and some action but was never implemented. The Mohawk River, which is a tributary of the Hudson River, rises near Lake Ontario and runs in a glacial meltwater channel just north of the Catskill Range of the Appalachian Mountains, separating the geographically distinct Adirondacks to the north. The Mohawk and Hudson Valleys form the only cut across the Appalachians north of Alabama. A navigable canal through the Mohawk Valley would allow an almost complete water route from New York City in the south to Lake Ontario and Lake Erie in the west. Via the canal and these lakes, other Great Lakes, and to a lesser degree related rivers, a large part of the continent's interior and then many settlements would be made well connected to the eastern seaboard. The problem was that land rises about 600 feet from the Hudson to Lake Erie. Locks at the time could handle up to 12 feet of lift, so even with the heftiest cuttings and viaducts, 50 locks would be required along a 360-mile canal. Such a canal would be expensive to build even with modern technology. In 1800, the expense was barely imaginable. President Thomas Jefferson called it little short of madness and rejected it. However, Hawley interested New York Governor DeWitt Clinton in the project. There was much opposition, and the project was ridiculed as, quote, Clinton's folly and, quote, Clinton's ditch. In 1817, though, Clinton received approval from the legislature for $7 million for construction. Construction began on July 4, 1817, at Rome, New York. The first 15 miles from Rome to Utica opened in 1819. At that rate, the canal would not be finished for 30 years. The main delays were caused by felling trees to clear a path through virgin forest and moving excavated soil, which took longer than expected, but the builders devised ways to solve these problems. The entire canal was officially completed on October 26, 1825. The Erie Canal was thus completed in 8 years at a cost of $7.143 million, which is the equivalent of $116 million in 2020. It was acclaimed as an engineering marvel that united the country and helped New York City develop as an international trade center. Its success propelled New York City into a major commercial center and encouraged canal construction throughout the United States. The need for connections through the Appalachian Mountains to eastern ports was not limited to New York. Pennsylvania would get into the canal business for the same reasons: better transportation to the interior for people, and from the interior to eastern markets, because of the success of the Erie Canal. Officials in Pennsylvania began looking to provide a southern route around the Allegheny Mountains. Having found a suitable route, construction of the Pennsylvania Canal commenced on July 4, 1826. From the beginning, an unbroken mountain in the Appalachian mountain chain, known as the Allegheny Front, created a formidable natural barrier. Building and maintaining the canals was an extremely labor-intensive proposition, one that required a good deal of brains as well as brawn. On the 11th of April, 1825, the Pennsylvania legislature established the Board of Canal Commissioners to oversee the construction and maintenance of the state's canal system. Many of the country's top engineers were engaged to bring the board's plans to fruition. Scores of laborers, Irish immigrants chief among them, were hired to dig canal channels and build numerous other structures associated with the canals, including lift locks, aqueducts, dams, reservoirs, feeders, canal basins, towpath bridges, and inclined planes. The engineering and geographical challenges the builders faced in the Allegheny Mountains were overcome by the construction of the Allegheny Portage Railroad, a 37-mile system of railroads and 10 inclined planes. It was completed in 1834, just in time to allow Pennsylvania's canal system to open during the same year. Hence, the Susquehanna and Ohio rivers were linked by a 394-mile canal between Philadelphia and Pittsburgh. A unique feature of this route was the combination of water and rail transport. As we mentioned, the Allegheny Portage Railroad had inclined planes that rose 1,399 feet to the summit station, 2,334 feet above sea level atop the Allegheny Mountains, and then fell 1,150 feet to Johnstown on the western side, where a 105-mile section of the canal, with 68 locks, ran the final leg on west to Pittsburgh. The Pennsylvania Canal played a significant role in the development of towns along its path throughout the state. Jack McGuire was born and raised in Saltsburg, Pennsylvania, a town of about 800 people a little more than 30 miles east of Pittsburgh. The community got its name from the discovery of salt and subsequent manufacturing of the mineral, but it really took off when the canal system was constructed there. Quoting McGuire, "With the beginning of the canal, the population in Saltsburg just blossomed. A lot of people came to town to be a part of the 2 canal building yards. Carpenters and other merchants moved to be close to the canal so they could easily transport their products around the state. At the height of the operation, a boat would pass on the canal every 15 minutes. When the canal was completed, it cut travel time from Philadelphia to Pittsburgh from 3 weeks to 3 to 5 days. The country was experiencing the Industrial Revolution, and southwestern Pennsylvania was rapidly increasing its manufacturing capacity. Pittsburgh was ramping up its coal and iron production, and neighboring cities were rich with products like natural gas and lumber. The city's population quadrupled during the canal's decades of operation. However, the Pennsylvania Canal would not be iconic or as successful as the Erie Canal in New York. Having served commerce and travelers for 18 years, the canal became obsolete in travel time and freight capacity in 1852. That year marked the beginning of the end for the Commonwealth's canal systems. The Pennsylvania Railroad began offering rail service from Philadelphia to Pittsburgh when it opened its Main Line Railroad in 1852, and traffic on the canal quickly dropped. The Pennsylvania Railroad would buy the state Main Line Canal at a public auction for $7.5 million on June 25, 1857. This included a reservoir built near the Portage Railroad in South Fork, Pennsylvania. This reservoir would spell disaster for the people of Johnstown in 1889. Most of the rest of this episode, including the information on the South Fork Fishing and Hunting Club and the events of the flood of 1889, pull heavily from the book written by famous Pittsburgh author David McCullough called The Johnstown Flood, and I cannot recommend it enough. It is a fantastic read. It has such a wealth of information. I'd love to someday do a podcast episode exclusively on this book. So, as canals proved their utility, and these man-made works were conquering the wilderness, connecting people and resources more than ever, the engineers and builders could not envision what might be done with their creations after they had moved on to the next new technology. The Western Reservoir, as it was called on state maps, was built between 1838 and 1853 to serve as supply water for the Western Division Canal of the main line of public works downhill in the borough of Johnstown. Locally, the dam was known as South Fork Dam due to its placement on the southern fork of the Little Conemaugh River, and the reservoir behind it would be referred to as Lake Conemaugh. I have personally been to the remnants of this reservoir, and it is a massive structure. It stood 72 feet above the valley floor and was 931 feet long, built with packed clay and topped with riprap, which is small jagged limestone. The base was 270 feet thick, with the top at 20 feet wide. Its face was very steep and covered with loose rocks, saplings, grasses, and bushes. The dam seemed much more like a natural formation than a work of man, because there was no suggestion at all of what lay on the other side, except at the eastern edge of the dam where a wide spillway was cut through solid rock of the hillside. The lake behind it was 2.5 miles long and 1 mile wide at its widest section. A hike the whole way around the shore was 5 miles. When the water was highest in the spring months, the lake covered 450 acres and was 75 feet deep in places. Estimates are that the weight of the water was 20 million tons. The difference of elevation between the top of the dam in South Fork and the borough of Johnstown was 450 feet, and following the route of the river from the dam would mark out 15 miles in distance. If you're paying attention to the dates, you'd know the reservoir was completed after Pennsylvania Railroad would initiate service between Philadelphia and Pittsburgh. Therefore, it was barely used in the few years after the reservoir was completed and was sold to the Pennsylvania Railroad, then to a local congressman, before being bought by the South Fork Fishing and Hunting Club. The South Fork Fishing and Hunting Club, chartered on November 15, 1879 in Pittsburgh, was the brainchild of Pittsburgh's Benjamin Ruff, a coke salesman and real estate broker. He would be the club's first president. The club bought the dam, the lake, and the surrounding 160 acres for $2,000, which would be close to $175,000 in today's money. By the time the property was bought by the club, it had been neglected so badly that the dam had a large break in it and was barely holding back much more than a shallow pool of water in the reservoir. The lead pipes used to draw down the level of the dam were sold for scrap by the previous owner. Not that they could be used, since the tower controlling the opening of the pipes had caught fire and burned down around the same time as the break, which was reported in the local newspaper in June 1862. Benjamin Ruff was not an engineer or experienced builder. When it was determined his original idea to lower the dam height by almost half and cut another spillway proved too costly, he set about repairing the dam. This was done by filling in the stone culvert at the base. This is where the discharge pipes would have been used, and filling in the breast of the dam with loose earth, rocks, and hay. It was not a sturdy construction up to the standards it was originally built to uphold. It was arrogance or greed which led Benjamin Ruff, and by extension his fellow industrialists at the South Fork Fishing and Hunting Club, to skimp on costs to repair the dam correctly and squeeze as much value as possible out of the land and its resources. But just who were these industrialists, these men at the top of the mountain with their clubhouse and cottages and sailboats? The biggest and wealthiest star of the club of industrialists was none other than Andrew Carnegie, steel magnate of Pittsburgh and one of the richest men in the world at the time. He, along with many of his business partners in Pittsburgh, such as Henry Clay Frick and Henry Phipps Jr., would be part of the 61 men listed as members. It reads like a who's who of Pittsburgh at the time. You had Andrew Mellon, a famous banker, Robert Pitcairn, the leader of the Pittsburgh division of the Pennsylvania Railroad, Durbin Horn of Horn's Department Store, and many others in the business of steel, coal, and banking. They all had many millions of dollars to their names, but would not be bothered with repairing the dam and the reservoir they would enjoy on summer days high atop the Allegheny Mountains. It is clear that the placement of the dam and reservoir was not a folly, but the timing of its construction led to its disuse by the Pennsylvania Canal, and its neglect afterward by its subsequent owners. Those owners, always looking for the next big thing, were content with selling lead pipes for scrap and putting a minimal effort necessary to get something that looked nice, even if it was rotten to its core. So this is how the fateful day of May 31st, 1889 came about. South Fork Dam, Lake Conemaugh, the club, and Johnstown are all situated in Cambria County. This area of Cambria County in west central Pennsylvania, in the heart of the Allegheny Mountains, was known for producing flash floods and seasonal flooding for many years before 1889. I am uniquely familiar with this since I've grown up in Cambria County and the city of Johnstown, and I live in the city of Johnstown currently. It was in the Conemaugh River Valley where Johnstown and another dozen communities sprouted to take advantage of the river and the local coal deposits, and at one time even iron ore. Johnstown held the largest employers of the area, Cambria Iron Company, among other industrial businesses, wire mills, and rail yards. It had grown to a population of close to 30,000 people by 1889, having been settled by German immigrants in 1800. On May 31st, when the rain began falling and would not let up, the people in the valley thought of nothing but an inconvenience. Many had lived through similar high water events and simply adjusted their plans to accommodate for the soggy conditions. Furniture was moved up to the second floor, and visits to neighbors to help with the task were common. The rail depot in Johnstown held trains that could no longer make the trek up the mountain due to washout conditions. It is estimated that the region received 6 to 10 inches of rain in a 24-hour period. The lack of concern for high water can be contrasted with the panic that set in at the South Fork Fishing and Hunting Club. On the morning of May 31st, in a farmhouse on a hill just above the South Fork Dam, Colonel Elias Unger, newly appointed president of the South Fork Fishing and Hunting Club, awoke to the sight of Lake Conemaugh swollen after a night-long heavy rain. Unger ran outside in the still pouring rain to assess the situation and saw that the water was nearly cresting the dam. He quickly assembled a group of men to save the face of the dam by trying to unclog the spillway. It was blocked by the broken fish trap and debris caused by the swollen water line. Other men tried digging a ditch at the other end of the dam on the western abutment, which was lower than the dam crest. The idea there was to let more water out of the lake to try to prevent overtopping of the crest, but without success. As I have learned in my research, and it is important to understand, an earthen dam is an incredibly useful design for large reservoir construction. It was the most popular form in the United States at the time, and would have served well for many decades with proper upkeep. If the dam had been repaired back to proper form and the discharge pipes replaced, it is likely there never would have been such a disaster. Unger knew that the worst thing for any earthen dam is the overtopping of the crest of the dam. Because of its construction, the looser earth and rocks on top would more easily be washed out and eat away at the earth until the dam failed entirely. Because of this, most of Unger's workmen remained on top of the dam, some plowing earth to raise it, while others tried to pile mud and rock on the face to save the quickly eroding wall. John Park, an engineer for the club, briefly considered cutting through the dam's end, where the pressure would be less to create another spillway, but eventually decided against it, as that would have quickly ensured the failure of the dam. Twice, under orders from Unger, Park rode on horseback to the nearby town of South Fork, to the telegraph office to send warnings to Johnstown, explaining the critical nature of the eroding dam. Unfortunately, Park did not personally take a warning message to the telegraph tower. He sent a man instead, who did not know the gravity with which to relay the message. But the warnings were not passed to the authorities in town, not because of malaise or foolishness, but because the telegraph lines had been cut due to downed trees, and the operator could only relay their messages to the next dispatch or tower. This prevented messages to come through to town with any sort of speed or urgency. Regardless, the message were warning of the failure of the dam, not the actual break of the dam, and those warnings had been sent so many times in the past that not many in the valley took heed. The yardmaster in East Conemaugh, where the trains on the Pennsylvania Railroad stopped on their way up the mountain, named J.C. Walkinshaw, received a message that read something like this. Quote, South Fork Dam is liable to break. Notify the people of Johnstown to prepare for the worst. Unquote. Frank Diekert, the freight agent at the Conemaugh Depot, was passed the same message and glanced at it with no concern. He mentioned it to a passerby and other agents at the depot. He had heard such warnings before. A ticketing agent, Charles Moore, showed the message to two men to read it aloud, and they laughed out loud. It was such a preposterous thought. Diekert did not spread the message beyond the depot. He did not move his family from the home he shared with them just down the street, nor did he send the message onto the central part of town. This was 1 p.m. on May the 31st, 1889. Unger, Park, and the rest of the men continued working until they exhausted themselves and their supplies to save the face of the dam. They abandoned their efforts at about 1:30 p.m., fearing that their efforts were futile and that the dam was at risk of imminent collapse. Unger ordered all of his men to fall back to high ground on both sides of the dam, where they could do nothing but watch and wait. During the day in Johnstown, the situation worsened as water rose to as high as 10 feet in the streets, closer to the western edges of town, and the stone bridge which carried the Pennsylvania Railroad over the Conemaugh River. Many downtown were beginning to become trapped in their homes. Wagons and teams of horses were called in for some cases to help with moving people and property to higher ground. But Johnstown had seen a dozen such floods. This one was not so different. Editor George Swank of the Johnstown Tribune was writing on the day's mishaps and events. People coming and going and dealing with the rising water. A story about a loose cow in the Stony Creek River was the talk of the day. At 2:45 p.m., another message reached Johnstown from the telegraph operator, Emma Ehrenfeld in South Fork. This one read, quote, "The dam is becoming dangerous and may possibly go," unquote. At the dam, John Park arrived after sending his messages in South Fork. Believing the dam to be in imminent danger, he considered cutting through the center of the dam to alleviate the force of the water and the potential for disaster. He and the workmen with Unger had cut an emergency spillway at the far end of the dam, but it was not doing enough. The original stone spillway could not do as much as it was designed to do because of the fish screens the club had installed to keep its prize bass from escaping downriver to feed the plebeians in the valley. If Park had cut into the center of the dam, which had a noticeable dip in it, it would have been bold action to ensure the dam's destruction, but possibly not Johnstown's destruction, which is why he ultimately did not do it. He had no authority to do it and would be personally responsible. Moreover, he would have no proof but his word that the dam could not have held up to the torrents of rain coming down that day. John Park took a break for some food at the clubhouse. When he returned, the situation had become worse. Water was now pouring over the face of the earthen dam, cutting a hole 10 feet wide and 4 feet deep on its face. It would grow in minutes to create a huge step on the dam facing the valley below. Quoting from McCullough's book, quote, "There is absolutely nothing anyone could do now but watch and wait and hope. Park, Unger, all of them just stood there looking at the water and the valley stretching away below." Unquote. It's hard to imagine what that looked like. A giant water slide. But it would look way more ominous as the wave gained speed, gained debris, and gained its reputation for death. It was 10 minutes to 3 in the afternoon on May 31st, 1889, and the South Fork Dam would cease to exist after this moment. Witnesses said it was one big push, and the dam simply moved away, unleashing 3.843 billion gallons of water in a moment. Modern dam breach computer modeling reveals that it took approximately 65 minutes for most of the lake to empty. The first town to be hit by the flood was South Fork. The water roared like a mighty battle, but thankfully most of the town was on high ground, and many people escaped by running up the nearby hills when the dam was still yet to be breached. Though not everyone got out as quickly. Emma Ehrenfeld in the telegraph tower, along with various trainmen passing time warming themselves at the coal stove, could see people running and shouting. One of them remarked, quote, "Look at the people running. I wonder what's wrong." Unquote. Those trainmen would be some of the first to describe the wall of water that roared down the valley toward them. Emma described it as a mountain coming for them. Train conductor Keltz described it as a large hill rolling over and over about 100 feet high. He, along with Emma and others, were able to escape to higher ground. In fact, Keltz ran to his freight train and pushed his engine past the water's path with just seconds to spare. Some 20 to 30 houses and a dozen other buildings were destroyed or washed away, and 4 people were killed in the town. The water rushed up to break tree trunks 50 feet up the opposing hillside. The water rushed through the narrow valley past South Fork, but luckily most of the way was devoid of any houses or communities. The route did carry the railroad, however. The water twisted and destroyed the rails and any equipment along the way. As the valley twisted and turned, it narrowed, and the wave grew in height, 70 feet in some places, until it encountered its first obstacle, a stone viaduct originally built for the Portage Railroad. 75 feet high and 80 feet across, the wave, which had houses, stores, trees, and rocks in it, temporarily clogged against this stone viaduct. This backwashed the valley upriver and even temporarily reformed Lake Conemaugh. The viaduct held momentarily before suddenly collapsing and renewing the energy of the dam break. The next community to be hit was Mineral Point, about a mile from the viaduct and one of the telegraph stops for messages from South Fork to Johnstown. Many of the 200 people living there had already fled for higher ground due to high water already, therefore only 16 perished, as the water hillside came rolling through. It wiped Mineral Point off the face of the earth. No houses, barns, buildings, or even topsoil remained. The village of East Conemaugh was next. From his idle locomotive in the rail yard above town, the engineer John Hess heard and felt the rumbling of the approaching flood. Throwing his locomotive into reverse, Hess raced backward through to East Conemaugh, the whistle blowing constantly. McCullough explains, quote, "A locomotive whistle going without let-up meant one thing on the railroad, and to everyone who lived near the railroad, it meant there was something very wrong. The whistle of John Hess's engine had been going now for maybe 5 minutes at most. It was not on long, but it was the only warning anyone was to hear, and nearly everyone in East Conemaugh heard it and understood almost instantly what it meant." Unquote. His warning saved many people who were able to reach high ground. Hess jumped from the still-moving locomotive, according to eyewitnesses. Hess later said he would have sent his engine all the way to Johnstown if the tracks were clear, but because of all the washouts on the tracks upstream, the yard in East Conemaugh was blocked up with trains and uncoupled cars. One of the waiting trains was the Day Express, with passengers from all across the country. The two trains sat in dreary weather for 5 hours, delayed and stuck where they were. Talk of the dam bursting its banks did enter the conversation, but was not seriously entertained by most. Once again from McCullough's book, quote, "Such a possibility as the carrying away of a train of cars on the Great Pennsylvania Railroad was never seriously entertained by anybody." Unquote. The trains had been moved to the tracks furthest away from the rising river, and that was considered to be the most prudent course of action. Walkinshaw, the yardmaster at East Conemaugh that I mentioned earlier, had been directing actions since 6 that morning. It seemed to him that the river had crested and the worst of the storm was over. To ask the passengers to disembark and carry their belongings up a wooded hill on what everyone considered to be a rumor was overkill. How wrong he was. He had received the latest from the telegraph towers upriver, and he took a rest in his office. He sat for just a moment before he heard the whistle from John Hess's engine. He clambered outside to yell for people to get off the tracks and up to high ground. Trainmen went along the tracks yelling for everyone to disembark and run for the hillside. "Get to the hill! Get to the hill!" they yelled. Reverend Robinson, a passenger on the Day Express, looked out the window and said the wave looked 50 feet high and about 300 yards away as they flung themselves out the doors and into the maelstrom. Some people saw no reason to go out into the weather and turn back till the relative safety of the cars. 2 of them, Jenny Paulson and Elizabeth Bryan, would not survive. It would be less than 2 minutes till the water came and knocked John Hess's locomotive off the tracks, and did similarly to the trains of the Day Express, and added their extreme heft to the debris that was churning over and over again in the raging maelstrom. The brick roundhouse, closest to the wave, had 9 engines in it when the flood struck. It was demolished in moments, sending the engines and other countless cars and passenger trains in the yard tumbling in a cacophony of destruction. Reverend Robinson was from Section 1 of the Day Express, and survived only by running around Section 2, which was 4 full car lengths, which miraculously withstood the commotion. So many large iron horses were shoved in the way that they somehow shielded parts of the yard on slightly higher ground. The wave behaved in odd ways and spared houses and cars where one would not expect it to. Unfortunately for its passengers, Section 1 of the Day Express was torn apart, along with its baggage car and engine. Its Pullman coach caught fire when it toppled. People in the community began running as they heard the whistle. The Reverend encountered them as he slipped up the rain-soaked streets, trying to find a way out of danger. Once he stood up a substantial height, he could see engineers and conductors clinging to their engines as they slowly rolled over. 40 houses on Front Street in East Conemaugh were swept away, along with several hotels, the post office, the train station, and most pieces of equipment in the yard. 30 locomotives, some weighing in excess of 80 tons, were taken by the flood, with an engine ending up all the way in Johnstown, which is more than a mile away. 28 people died in East Conemaugh. plus an additional 38 passengers of the day express. The wave's height was now dissipating because the valley began to widen and swing westward, but the winding river had limited the wave's speed up to this point. Now it had a straight shot towards Johnstown. The wave is estimated to be traveling now at 40 miles per hour. It was 4:02 p.m. on May the 31st, 1889. Before hitting the main part of Johnstown, the flood surge hit the Cambria Ironworks at the town of Woodvale. At the time, Woodvale had a population just above 1,000. Unlike East Conemaugh, they had no warning of the impending doom. It took all of 5 minutes to wipe the community off the map. The only thing left standing was part of the wool mill. 255 houses were taken away by the flood, along with every barn and mill in town. No landmarks were left to show where anything would have been. The boilers exploded in the gaudier wireworks when the flood hit, causing thick black smoke to be jettisoned into the sky, which was seen by the Johnstown residents. Miles of its barbed wire became entangled in the debris in the floodwaters and contributed to the misery that was to come. 314 people died in the flood from Woodvale, meaning 1 of every 3 people living there had met their end on May 31st, 1889. It was now only a few hundred yards down the valley to Johnstown. The people in town noticed that the sky had begun to clear. The storm had started to let up, and the river in the lower part of town had crested and started to recede from its height of close to 8 to 10 feet in the lowest parts of town. The worst seemed to be behind them. Little did they know their day would get so much worse. Most of the people in Johnstown never saw the water coming. They only heard it. It was described by survivors as a low rumble which gained volume until it became a roar like thunder. Those that had a look at it described a black smoke or mist that hung above the wave, which by this point was rocks, trees, locomotives, and the remains of buildings, and hundreds of bodies, both living and dead. The mass struck Johnstown harder than it struck anything yet encountered, due to the speed it gathered in the straightening valley from East Conemaugh. It was 4:07 p.m. on May 31st, 1889. Some people in the streets, realizing the danger, tried to escape by running towards high ground. Many thousands of people were caught up in the surging floodwater. Some stood on their roofs and hoped for the best. Others were in upper floors of buildings downtown, struck dumb with horror. Parents snatched children in their arms with a mad dash up the stairs as their homes disintegrated around them. People were crushed by pieces of debris or trapped in their houses as they floated off their foundations. The wave had 3 major paths of destruction, with one sticking more or less to the original flow of the Little Conemaugh and the valley beyond, decimating Washington Street and much of the millworks of Cambria Iron. Another one smashed straight into the center of town, centered on the Methodist Church and the park, which we call Central Park. The last path struck east behind the church to drown the neighborhood of Conemaugh, headed for areas of town on the Stony Creek. Big brick buildings like the Holbert House, a large boarding house on Upper Main Street, collapsed with many people trapped inside. Lighter wooden-framed houses simply floated in the wave until they smashed against other houses and obstacles. Every tree in the park was uprooted. Major landmarks in town were felled in an instant. The library, the telegraph office, the German Lutheran Church, the Opera House, the fire station, and countless others were smashed to pieces. Some of the surviving buildings would be spared only because others took the brunt of the force of the wave. The Methodist Church that I mentioned still stands today in Johnstown and seems to have shielded several buildings from being destroyed. Minutes after the wave hit the eastern side of town, the central path of the flood ran out of valley and smashed into Yoder Hill, which is now called Westmont, 550 feet of steep wooded hillside. This caused the wave to backwash the town and caused the Stony Creek to flow upstream into the Kernville neighborhood, drowning parts of town that would have otherwise been shielded from the initial thrust. Those who managed to stay afloat on pieces of floating debris waited hours for help to arrive or for a fortuitous tree branch along their way downstream. However, too many who might have been safely pulled through the wreckage of town would be struck against the stone bridge on the Conemaugh River after the meeting of the Stony Creek and Little Conemaugh. This edge of town saw spectacular heroism and agonizing sorrow. The stone bridge, which was a substantial arch structure, carried the Pennsylvania Railroad across the Conemaugh River. The debris carried by the flood smashed against its great arches and formed a temporary dam at the bridge. All of the water in the valley would have to pass beyond this bridge, and it was a place where many people found themselves headed. Debris had built up rapidly, as described by McCullough, quote, now boxcars, factory roofs, trees, telegraph poles, hideous masses of barbed wire, hundreds of houses, many squashed beyond recognition, others still astonishingly intact, dead horses and cows, and hundreds of human beings, dead and alive, were driven against the bridge until a small mountain had formed, higher than the bridge itself, and nearly watertight. So once again, for the second time within an hour, Lake Conemaugh gathered in a new setting. Now it was spread across Johnstown and well beyond. Unquote. This new dam would hold an unforeseen murderous nightmare for the survivors of the flood. When darkness fell that night, the debris at the bridge caught fire. No one knows for sure how. Perhaps it was coal from one of the stoves in a smashed house, or the oil leaked from the locomotives. It was 6 p.m. on May 31st, 1889, and the stone bridge became a large funeral pyre for the dead and those soon to be, so unfortunate as to be trapped inside its mass, unable to escape. Editor George Swank of the Tribune watched it from his office window. As quoted by McCullough, he wrote that it burned, quote, with all the fury of the hell you read about, cremation alive in your own home, perhaps a mile from its foundation, dear ones slowly consumed before your eyes, and the same fate yours a moment later. Unquote. At least 80 people died at the stone bridge. The fire burned for 3 days. After floodwaters receded, the pile of debris at the bridge was seen to cover 30 acres and reach 70 feet in height. It took workers 3 months to remove the massive debris, the delay owing in part to the huge quantity of steel barbed wire from the ironworks that were entangled in the wreckage. In fact, dynamite was eventually used to clear it. The descriptions of the flood from survivors on rooftops or in their attics is, to use just one inadequate word, frightening. Victor Heiser, a local teenager whose family ran a dry goods store in the upper part of Washington Street, rode the wave on his family's barn roof before being catapulted onto another house as it was collapsing, then back onto that roof to ride the wave through town. Heiser describes the fear he saw and many grotesque sights. Entire families with their houses smashed onto them in an instant. A black boy soaked and stark naked on a rooftop, praying on his knees for God to spare him. His neighbor, Mrs. Fenn, clinging onto a tar barrel. Heiser would be part of the wave which struck Kernville with some force, but his speed was such that he was able to jump onto the third story of a still intact brick building, along with a dozen other survivors. Many dozens of people had retreated to the Holbert house, thinking it was sturdy enough and tall enough to handle any danger from the flooding that was plaguing most of town. The stonemason Jeremiah Smith, along with his wife, their 9-year-old daughter Florence, 7-year-old son Frank, and 4-month-old baby, had taken refuge in the Holbert house. Jeremiah at some point had returned to their home for supplies and survived the flood with their house intact. His family, however, died along with 50 others when the Holbert house caved in. One story from a survivor of the collapsed Holbert house is incredible and terrifying. Mr. Hartley, a guest at the Holbert from Philadelphia, having heard the shouting in the streets and the loud crashes, started up the staircase with Miss Carrie Richards, Charles Butler of the Cambria Iron Company, and the brother of the owner, Walter Benford. Hartley, taking one hand while Butler took the other, led Richards up the stairs, but somehow all of them were separated with the rush of others into the hallways and stairways. Hartley says he was pinned under debris as the roof lifted off the building, but was able to struggle free in a moment and then jump onto that roof, which was now carrying several chambermaids, the owner F.A. Benford, and his brother. Neither Mr. Butler nor Miss Richards would survive. And now we have the frightening but incredible story from Gertrude Quinn, one of several children of James Quinn, who was a local dry goods proprietor. Gertrude was home with 4 of her siblings, her nursemaid Libby Hip, her aunt Abby Geiss, and Geiss's infant son Richard. James returned home from the store within minutes of the wave reaching town. Gertrude would later describe the way he instructed those in the house to follow him up the hill as fast as they could go and return for nothing. James carried the infant Marie, who was sick with measles, and led the others except his eldest son Vincent from their house up to Green Hill, which would today locally be identified with Daisytown. It's only when he reached the hill when he realized Gertrude, being carried by the nursemaid, had turned back to stay in the house, along with Aunt Abby and her baby. James had decided to go back for them when the wave hit their house and sent it toppling over into the maelstrom. Gertrude hid with her nursemaid Libby in a cupboard on the 3rd floor of their large home, but within seconds the house broke up around them, and 6-year-old Gertrude was plunged into the muddy water. She never saw Libby, Aunt Abby, or her infant cousin ever again. Struggling to a mattress to keep herself afloat, Gertrude rode the wave up the Stony Creek into Kernville as far as Hornerstown, calling out to people on houses and rooftops for help. Gertrude was praying in German, which was the only language she knew how to pray in, and it seems that God answered her prayers. One man, Maxwell McAaron, had swam out to her from a big roof, which was carrying 20 people down Bedford Street. She clung to his neck until 2 men in a small white house called out to him to throw her over to them. McAaron threw Gertrude 15 feet through the air for her to be caught by the men, who then wrapped her in a blanket and took her up the hill. She would spend the day with a family called Metz and several other refugees until the next day. McAaron would be rescued 4 miles downriver, still atop that mattress, by men with ropes. Similar rescue operations would happen throughout the night and into the next day, with people in surviving houses and buildings putting out ladders, ropes, and poles, helping people to safety. There were not many families that were found intact, and once the flood took you, all feared the worst outcomes. James Quinn, Gertrude's father, spent the night on Green Hill with his surviving children, without much hope to find his son, Vincent, or the rest of those who stayed behind in the house. Barbara Foster, one of Gertrude's aunts, found out that she was safe and went to tell James. Their reunion was a rare but welcome happy moment in the morose days and weeks that would follow. The total death toll was calculated originally as 2,209 people, making the disaster the largest loss of civilian life in the United States at the time. This number is still the best estimate, as even the most thorough searches might have missed some bodies forever encased in flood debris or mud downriver. Author David McCullough points out that at least one man reported as presumed dead, which means that he was not known to have been found, in fact survived. In 1900, Leroy Temple showed up in Johnstown to reveal he had not died, but had extricated himself from the flood debris at the stone bridge below Johnstown and walked out of the valley, immediately picked up his life, and moved to Massachusetts. According to records compiled by the Johnstown Area Heritage Association, bodies were found as far away as Cincinnati and as late as 1911. Among the victims were residents of 13 different states. 99 families were wiped out. There were 396 children that were lost to the flood. 124 women and 198 men were widowed. 98 children were orphaned, and 1/3 of the dead, over 700 people, were never identified. Their remains were buried in the Plot of the Unknown in Grandview Cemetery, which is a haunting sight that I have seen for myself. The descriptions of the bodies of the unidentified dead is melancholy to say the least. McCullough writes many in his book. Quote, unknown, female, light hair, about 15 years. Unknown, male age 50, weight 160, height 5 feet 9 inches, sandy hair, plain ring on third finger of left hand with initials C.R. 1869. Unquote. It was the worst flood to hit the U.S. in the 19th century. 1,600 homes were destroyed, $17 million in property damage, which is approximately $500 million in modern values, and 4 square miles of downtown Johnstown were completely destroyed. Cambria Iron Company's facilities were heavily damaged. They only returned to full production after 18 months of reconstruction. Working 7 days and nights, workmen built a wooden trestle bridge to temporarily replace the huge stone railroad viaduct, which had been destroyed by the flood. The Pennsylvania Railroad restored service to Pittsburgh, 55 miles away, by June 2nd. Food, clothing, medicine, and other provisions began arriving by rail. Morticians traveled by railroad. Johnstown's first call for help requested coffins and undertakers. At its peak, the Army of Relief Workers totaled about 7,000 people. One of the first outsiders to arrive was Clara Barton, nurse and founder and president of the American Red Cross. Barton arrived on June 5th to lead the group's first major disaster relief effort. She did not leave for more than 5 months. Donations for the relief effort came from all over the United States and overseas. Over $3.7 million was collected for the Johnstown relief effort from within the U.S. and from 18 foreign countries, including Russia, Turkey, France, Great Britain, Australia, and Germany. Many in the community and across the world held the South Fork Fishing and Hunting Club liable for the disaster. The club had bought and redesigned the dam to turn the area into a vacation retreat in the mountains. They were accused of failing to maintain the dam properly so that it was unable to contain the additional water of the unusually heavy rainfall. They did so without any regard for the safety of the people downstream. However, Pittsburgh lawyers and club members, Philander Knox and James Hay Reed, successfully argued the dam's failure was a natural disaster, a quote-unquote act of God, and therefore beyond the club's liability. Popular culture remembers the flood as a cautionary tale and an example of the socioeconomic class conflict becoming more common in the United States during this time period. Popular culture was quick to blame the club, and I would agree with this assessment, as is reflected by Isaac Reed's poem. Quote, many thousand human lives, butchered husbands, slaughtered wives, mangled daughters, bleeding sons, hosts of martyred little ones, worse than Herod's awful crime, sent to heaven before their time, lovers burnt and sweethearts drowned, darlings lost but never found. All the horrors that hell could wish, such was the price that was paid for fish. Unquote. Investigations since the flood have determined the main contributing factors to the failure of the dam were the lowering the dam by as much as 3 feet, which is for a carriage path to the clubhouse, and failing to replace the discharge pipes at the base of the dam, which cut in half the safe discharge capacity of the dam. This somber thread of history begins in the desire to move people and goods across the Appalachian Mountains in early America, gets neglected for decades, modified by a club of millionaires from Pittsburgh, and bursts forth with deadly speed to take over 2,000 lives with it. The Great Flood of 1889 in Johnstown, Pennsylvania, would claim many lives, among them my great-great-granduncle Patrick Shellhammer and his son Lawrence. So this thread of history is part of my family history and my life growing up in the city of Johnstown. But it's more than that. It is a cautionary tale, one that challenges us to respect the power of nature, to listen to the warning signs all around us, and to never modify a qualified engineer's design. Thank you for listening to Episode 5 on the Johnstown Flood. This has been Threads of History. I am Mike Shellhammer. Thank you for listening. You can email your comments and suggestions to threads.historypodcast@gmail.com. Listen to more Threads of History on Anchor, Google Podcasts, Apple Podcasts, and Spotify.